Ah, okay, colleagues. It's exactly 12 o'clock. Welcome to this webinar, which SIGAS is jointly doing with the Institute for Race Relations. I have to thank Terence Corrigan for this, and I hope that our cooperation continues. Um, colleagues, I will ask you all to please mute your microphones except for the speaker. And then after each of them are done, we will have a Q&A session at the end. Our first speaker is Professor Philippe Berger. He is Professor of Economics and Dean of Economic and Management Sciences at our Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences at the University of the Free State. So, Philippe, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chair. So good afternoon, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to be here this afternoon. So South Africans do not have a deep culture of coalitions. There were a few coalitions on provincial and municipal level, but most of these were quite unstable. We will therefore need to learn to dance the coalition dance, a dance that under the best of conditions is fraught with partners stepping on each other's toes. And all of this happens in an economy that is not in good shape. We sit with an economy with negative per capita growth, high and rising unemployment, poverty, inequality, a government deeply in debt, and 20 million or 26 million people on grants. So how did the ANC hope to continue winning elections amid all these problems? Well, it seems their primary approach this election was promising more grants and free services. Think the NHI, think the promise to make the social relief and distress grant permanent and increase it to the upper poverty line. So if you want to understand why the ANC lost KZN, then remember July 2021 and the riots in KZN and Gauteng. We all remember the scenes on our TVs of crowds looting shopping malls, with some people turning or running off with TVs and fridges. We all laughed at the dude who could not fit a TV into his car. However, what struck me, and I wrote about this in the Business Day at the time, were the old people and poor people who essentially looted groceries. You saw gogos leaving shops with 1 or 2 loaves of bread under their arm, or a bag full of canned food. Yes, that looting was criminal behavior, but essentially sad and tragic. For that to happen and to take place almost 3 decades after the dawn of democracy, I think there's an echo there somewhere. Okay. After the dawn of democracy, a democracy that promised a better life for all is truly sad. And this is where the ANC, I think, miscalculated with their promises of grants and the NHI. In the final instance, a grant is a palliative. It does not give you hope for the future. It does not give you a picture of what tomorrow could look like. And that's essentially what a political party needs to do. It needs to tell you what tomorrow will look like. Consider being a young person coming from a school that shortchanged you in terms of the education it gave you. You're unemployed, and if you're lucky, you might receive an SRD grant. You live from hand to mouth. Some days you might be lucky enough to get a job as a day laborer, but most days you have nothing to do and little to eat. You might have some younger brothers and sisters whose child support grants are paid to your grandmother, who support all of you with her old age pension. This is the reality for many, many households. This young person, jobless and poor, realizes that this is as good as it is going to get. There are no job prospects on the horizon, no promise of improvement. The same, of course, goes for people of all ages, but if you're young, it's more acute. So grants can't make this better. People need more than that. They need a purpose, a dream to steer their lives. And I know this might sound old-fashioned, but ultimately having a job to do, it gives you a sense of fulfillment. It at least gives you a sense of purpose. You can put some food on the table, provide for yourself, your family, a better life.
Philippe, you're muted, Philippe. Sorry.
Should I just start again?
Yes, please.
Okay. So apologies for that. Okay. So thanks for having me. So South Africans do not have a deep culture of coalitions. There were a few coalitions on provincial and municipal level, but most of these were quite unstable. We will therefore need to learn to dance the coalition dance, a dance that under the best of conditions is fraught with partners stepping on each other's toes. And all of this happens in a country that is not in a good shape. We sit with an economy with negative per capita growth, high and rising unemployment and poverty, inequality, a government deeply in debt, and 26 million people, almost 42% of the population, on grants. How did the ANC hope to continue winning elections amid all of these problems? Well, it seems their primary focus or approach this election was to promise grants and free services. You can think of the NHI, think of the promises to make the social relief of distress grant permanent and increase it to the upper poverty line. So this story of grants plays also with what happened in KZN 2 years, because I think if you want to understand why the ANC lost KZN, you need to look at the riots in 2021 in KZN and Gauteng. We all remember the scenes on our TVs of crowds looting shopping malls with some people running off with TVs and fridges. You know, we all laughed at the dude who could not fit a TV into his car. However, what struck me at the time were the old people and the poor people who essentially looted groceries. You saw gogos leaving shops with 1 or 2 loaves of bread under their arm. But, you know, although that looting was criminal, I think that it was also essentially sad and tragic. For that to take place almost 3 decades after the dawn of democracy that promised a better life for all, is truly sad. And this is where the ANC miscalculated with their promises of grants and the NHI. In the final instance, a grant is a palliative. It does not give you hope for the future. It does not give you a picture of what tomorrow could look like. And that is what political parties do. They sell you a picture of what tomorrow could look like. Consider being a young person coming from a school that shortchanged you in terms of your education. You're unemployed and maybe you get an SRD grant. You live from hand to mouth. If you're lucky enough, you might have a day job or a job as a day laborer from time to time. But for most days, you have nothing really to do and little to eat.
Sorry, colleagues, can you please mute yourself while the speakers here, please? Thank you. Go ahead, Philippe. Sorry.
So you might also have some younger siblings who receive child support grants. You might have a grandmother who gets an old age pension, but you know, this reality is as good as it is going to get for you. There are no prospects, no job prospects on the horizon, no promise of improvement. And, you know, in that sense, a grant cannot make it better. People need more than that. They need a purpose, a dream to steer their lives. So although this might sound old-fashioned, ultimately having a job to do gives you some sense of fulfillment, or at least some sense of purpose, a way to put food on the table, provide for yourself and your family, a better life for all. This, however, is something that millions of unemployed do not have. So that brings us back to the question, why did so many of, or almost half of the voters in KZN under these conditions then vote for the one man who above all others was responsible for the economic malaise in which we as a country find ourselves? And even though they received less support than in the past, why do so many people still vote for Julius Malema and his EFF, a party not unaffected by accusations of unemployment? In answering these questions, it will also become clear why a coalition between the ANC and the EFF or MK is not as straightforward as it might look. You see, both MK and the EFF represent disgruntled, disillusioned former ANC voters. These are voters who believed in the past the better future for all promise and got disillusioned. They got alienated and now have a huge sense of exclusion. So founded a decade ago, the EFF represented an alienated, excluded youth who feel that the deal struck in 1994 is not a deal from which they benefit. Malema was brilliant in mobilizing large numbers of these youths, and although his vote in this election waned a bit, he still, broadly speaking, represent a cohort of people, young people mostly, disillusioned with the ANC and its policies. These voters will not necessarily like a coalition with the very same ANC unless it brings them demonstrable benefits. Anything less will cost the EFF support in the future. In the case of Zuma, it's a bit more complex. You need to understand the man and the role he played in KZN over almost 40 years. This was the man who in the early 90s played a big role in pacifying the conflict between the IFP and the ANC. From very humble rural beginnings via years of struggle and prison, he then made it to deputy president of both the party and the country. But then because of alleged corruption, President Mbeki axed him. Zuma, however, fought back. He was the quintessential underdog. And once back, he mobilized KZN in support of the ANC. KZN became the province with the most delegates to the 2012 ANC conference. The man from humble beginnings in rural Nkandla made it big. He became what was commonly known as number one. This was aspirational stuff. But then, of course, it all came down crashing. We had Zuma must fall. And the people from KZN, well, they remained poor, but they believed him when he told them, or many of them believed him, when he told them that he was a victim of the Constitution, hamstrung by the Constitution. He couldn't do what he wanted to do for them. And ultimately, he was brought down, so he told them, by the agents of white monopoly capital. So all of that needs to be seen together with the man portraying himself as the victim, but also explaining why the large numbers of the population in KZN remain excluded. And he as Julius Malema capitalized on this with respect to the youth, Jacob Zuma played on that together with a bit of a Zulu nationalist card on mobilizing the people from KZN for his party. So again, in this case, it will not be easy for the ANC to go into coalition with MK. These supporters are not just former ANC members in an ANC spin-out party like Gwede Mantashe called them a week ago just after the election. These two parties represent groups of people seriously aggrieved by the ANC. They are angry and disgruntled. And if the ANC wants a coalition with these parties, it will have to offer them something more to address that anger and disgruntlement. And it will need to be more than just more grants. Should MK and the EFF enter a coalition with the ANC and not deliver on addressing the anger and disgruntlement, both MK and the EFF will lose support in the next election. And that will give them some credibility problems. So if the ANC does go into a coalition with either or both the EFF and MK, addressing the anger and disgruntlement will probably result in rising government expenditure and debt. And if that coalition also must raise taxes to deliver on all these promises that will cost all of this money, we can see investors running away. Also, given the leftist statist views of both the EFF and MK, we might also see more interventionism, regulations, and unwise political support to public corporations. So over the years or last year or so, we have also seen the private sector assisting government in resolving, things like the electricity and transport and harbor infrastructure bottlenecks. That will probably all come to nothing and to an end with this sort of coalition. So financial markets will probably also not look favorably onto a coalition with such populists. In addition, MK made it quite clear that for it to go into a coalition with the ANC, it wants the political aid of Ramaphosa. This will scare investors also away. So in brief, a coalition between the ANC and EFF or MK will in all likelihood be an economic disaster. Either the ANC delivers on all these promises that such a coalition will require, which will be unaffordable and economically counterproductive, or if they try to contain the cost and therefore not deliver on the promises, the coalition will fall apart and introduce further instability. However, there are a number of cool heads in the ANC who would not like to go down this route. They would rather go for a coalition with the Democratic Alliance, or rather than have the ANC go it alone in a minority government. A coalition with the DA can take two forms. One is a real coalition where the ANC and the DA, there's somebody not muted. where the ANC and the DA parcel out cabinet posts and maybe bring in something like the IFP. However, for a party like the DA, this holds a serious danger that if things go badly over the next 5 years, the DA will be seen as complicit and in the next election lose votes. Should the DA nevertheless enter such a coalition, government's economic policy will pivot slightly to a more pro-market direction, with possibly a greater focus on frugality and efficiency in government and in general. But implementing these sorts of measures with a senior partner being a reluctant partner will be very difficult and frustrating. And such frustration might lead to a collapse of such a coalition a year or 2 years into it. It will be inherently unstable. Also because these two parties, the DA and ANC, are philosophically quite apart and different. Think about how they differ on foreign policy on Ukraine, Gaza, how the country should deal with Russia, Iran, Israel. They're quite apart on these things. The second form of coalition between the ANC and DA entails the ANC running the executive branch of government and DA running parliament. The ANC will then, appoint the president and the ministers, and the DA may be the speaker or deputy speaker or chairs of parliamentary committees. But such an agreement would also require the DA not to introduce a no confidence vote in the ANC president in future, and to also approve budgets. We very often forget that the most important part of Parliament and the biggest job it has is to pass budgets, the Minister of Finance's budget, the budgets of all the departments. And if you do not have agreement on that, you have everything comes to a standstill in government because it will be unfunded. But the question is whether the ANC will go for such a thing unless it includes such an agreement of not introducing no confidence votes and going for the budget. For every other piece of legislation that we will then need to see mini coalitions, or negotiate from bill to bill that they want to pass. So we will probably in such a case not see a lot of legislation pass Parliament. Because of the gridlock. The last option then, and I'm almost done, is a minority government. And I think where there will not be any formal coalition agreement, that is in essence very unstable, and getting anything through Parliament will be almost impossible, a case of gridlock, because there will be a lot of party political grandstanding with every piece of legislation that comes to Parliament. And if you do not get majorities there, where you have to negotiate from act to act or bill to bill to pass through Parliament, again, you might get to a case where something like the budget is not passed, you can see this might end up in quite a big and a messy situation. So to conclude, I think political disgruntlement and disillusion on the part of former ANC members in the EFF and MK make coalition formation with the political left quite difficult. And should it succeed, the economic consensus will be likely to be quite negative. On the political right, coalition formation with the ANC and the DA is no less difficult, especially given their significant philosophical differences. The instability into which this will result, even if they succeed in cobbling together some coalition, will be no less serious. Such instability will also not be conducive to investment, with investors preferring to stand on the sidelines for a year or two to first check out how such coalitions shape up. So, lastly, hang on to your seats. It's going to be a rocky 5 years. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Burger, for that. Colleagues, I'll ask you all to mute yourselves and to allow the speakers to have the floor, after which we'll have Q&A. Our next speaker is Evan Barlow, the chairman of Executive Outcomes and security advisor to several African governments. General Barlow, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be having a look at security in post-election South Africa, because this is the cornerstone on which state stability hinges. And obviously, the safeguarding of our national interests, vital interests, and foreign interests starts and fails with the national security strategy and the associated national security policy. This obviously includes a host of things such as border security, economic or financial security, food, water, and energy security, telecommunications, cyber and information security, land and environmental security, and the list goes on and on. And human security is a critical element of this. So regardless of the type of government we get and who that will consist of, to turn the security deficit around, which we are experiencing, is going to need a new approach to counter what is essentially a war against the state and the citizens. As someone recently wrote me, the ultimate victor in the art of war, and make no mistake, we are engaged in an assault on our security, is not the nation with the most powerful security forces. Let me just say, security forces is intelligence services, law enforcement, and our armed forces. But it's the nation whose leaders wield strategy like a surgeon's knife, precise, unwavering, and always 2 steps ahead of the security challenges, the challenges, as well as the threats. So this new government we get ought to be the vanguard in ensuring peace, stability, and security of the nation. It must create a safe and secure environment in which people can become the best they can be. It has to be proactive and not reactive. Far too often we see we're lacking preemption, and even when we are reactive, we're not very effectively reactively. So it must secure an alienated and marginalized voiceless people who are under criminal and security attack virtually on a daily basis, and who yearn for a return to strong law and order, economic growth, and ultimately self-respect. So this requires security planning and implementation, along with firm and decisive leadership. And it's often here that promises made are promises that are seldom kept. We cannot afford another outbreak in anarchy, criminality, and civil unrest, as we witnessed in 2021. Voters who feel hard done by may mobilize and attempt to disrupt the nation. And to achieve this, they're going to explore all available media platforms. So South Africa cannot afford to tolerate this wave of insecurity across the country, as well as the reputational damage it creates, which is rather immense, and people often don't think about that. We are currently experiencing an exodus of scientific, business, and entrepreneurial brainpower, which results in the closure of businesses and corporations for several reasons. But stability and security are 2 of those reasons. And this can and has a massive negative economic impact, as these problems create unemployment, degrade the economy, lead to anti-government sentiment and uprisings, along with an increase in crime and stability. And this degrades our national security. The reality is that we are facing numerous domestic and regional security challenges and threats that have dramatic effects on our national security and ultimately our national trajectory. Our national security ought to underpin the national trajectory. A negative trajectory is an indication of a dysfunctional national strategy, as well as the numerous security threats that impact on it. And this weakness and failure has an extraordinary impact on the national security strategy. All hostile challenges, and threats must be measured against the national security strategy and the extent to which they are likely to impact on our sovereignty, territory, and on our national, foreign, and vital interests. This will in all probability require a serious reassessment of our current national security strategy and the associated national security policy. So it must make provision for calculated, realistic, and proportional responses preemptively aimed at justifying actions against the state, and it has to be based on the level of threats. It must also be holistic and include every identified facet of security to guide and protect the successful implementation of the national strategy, which obviously impacts on our national trajectory. So we have to find the appropriate ways and means to respond to security challenges. And these challenges and threats must be clearly expressed in terms of what are they, what's anticipated, what is current, and what are predicted. What approaches and methods or ways will the state employ to manage, mitigate, or negate them? And obviously, what assets or means are available to do this? We often see knee-jerk plans and conflicting government messages disconnected with the realities and impacts of our national security deficits. And this must be avoided, especially when they are not aligned with a national security strategy or where they actually exert a negative impact on the national trajectory. Furthermore, the national security strategy will only be feasible if the ends, ways, and means are balanced, aligned, and synchronized. And therefore, planners have to understand the domestic, in other words, the national and foreign policies and the trajectory the government intends to pursue. It must identify, assess, respond, support, and strengthen government direction and policy. But this requires competent strategic thinking processes along with a strategic vision. Our strategists and planners must understand the challenges and problems and the threats facing the state as well as their origins. This also requires foresight and insight into government directives and policies and the resistance or the support they may encounter. They must understand the government's direction in terms of national, regional, continental, and international positioning. In other words, how does the state envision itself being seen not only domestically and regionally, but internationally as well? And how will this vision be received, not only within our country, but beyond as well? They must understand how the state intends to utilize and exploit its elements of national power and the strengths to ensure the sovereignty, security, territoriality of the citizens is guaranteed. They must apply intuitive, intent-driven, and strategic thinking to understand how the ends, ways, and means may complement or limit each other and develop realistic, relevant, and sustainable strategies. And I think this is where we often fall down. A strategy is developed, but it cannot be sustained, and then it's actually, in my opinion, worthless. They must recognize and understand the role that each government agency and department must play to ensure the security, stability, and territoriality of the state. They must further recognize and understand the criticality of the informational domain and how information can be exploited to best effect. And then lastly, they must understand how the implementation of the national strategy can or may impact on the prevailing regional geopolitics and international relations. Because ultimately, we are part of a much larger community, not just a small little country all on its own. A reassessed and revitalized national security strategy's success will lie in its implementation, as actions speak louder than words. So a poor national security strategy, but that's well executed, will give us better results than a brilliant national security strategy that's poorly implemented or not implemented at all. But for all this to happen, we require a sound national security policy, which is essential for the implementation and execution of our national security strategy. And this national security policy will require medium and long-term security threat and risk analysis and assessment, considering not only the likelihood and level of danger posed by the security challenges and threats, but additionally the time and cost required to develop the means to mitigate or deter them, and then, of course, under what circumstances the policy should be implemented. So based on that, the national security policy must at a minimum address what types of intelligence services are required, what are their mandates, and what are their responsibilities. And I know we have several intelligence agencies, but it's almost as though there's a disconnect between these agencies, and the one hand never knows what the other hand is doing, and when they do know, they don't tell one another. We need to really reassess the role and mission of the security forces, how they should be structured, postured, controlled, trained, led, and equipped. And of course, they should be structured to support the national strategy, because strategy ultimately drives how these forces should be structured. We need to look at the type and level of internal security. What escalation may be required? Which additional services are responsible for supporting internal security goals and policies? And how should they be deployed? I believe that given their domestic footprint, consideration should be given to vetted private security companies and how they can provide domestic security assistance and inputs. We need to look at how industry can be motivated and exploited to provide equipment, technology, and other support to strengthen our national security policy. In terms of the economy, our policy and budgetary constraints involved in supporting and sustaining the national security strategy ought to be very well assessed. We need to look at what infrastructure is required in order to support the national security strategy. And then, of course, what role can the populace play in enhancing the national security strategy, and how best they can be leveraged to gain support to counter domestic as well as external threats and challenges. We need to look at the current and predicted geopolitical impacts and the consequences of choosing allies or rejecting potential allies from either the Eastern Bloc or the Western Bloc. We need to look at how various media platforms can either add to or distract from the national security policy. In terms of direction, how do these policies influence the national and foreign policies of the state in terms of allies, and what impact will they have on regional stability? We're already seeing that by deploying forces in certain Africa countries from the region and from hostile neighboring areas, there's already a pushback on what we are doing. And then, of course, how will the national security impact on domestic support, regional geopolitics, and international relations? So it remains a truism that a government that has not prepared itself for success has prepared itself for failure. So whoever this new government is, they must not only be able to talk the talk, they must be able to walk the walk. And part of walking the walk boils down to poor planning prevents poor performance, as well as preemption. This will give the government, or rather, this will give the citizens renewed support to the government's security strategy and plans, as well as deter those security challenges and threats that we will be facing. However, when national security fails, national chaos is bound to follow. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, General. Colleagues, there was a question asked in the chat function if this recording would be made available, and the answer to that is yes. So you just need to request it, but you'll have to give us a day in terms of dealing with the ICT aspects of it. Our next speaker is Terence Corrigan. He's the Project and Publications Manager at the Institute for Race Relations. And to reiterate, we are doing this webinar jointly with the Institute for Race Relations, and I'm very grateful for Terence's support in this. Terence, the floor is yours.
Hi there, and thank you to the university and to all of you for making the time. First of all, can I just check that you have my presentation up on the screen, because last time, well, let's just say I'm technologically challenged.
Yes, it's there.
Right. Okay, great. Okay, I'll be taking you through some thoughts on what this election has meant, and I am sitting here. Somebody, the IRR and the centre have done a number of these webinars together, and we did one shortly before the election. And there I spoke about what this election and the election campaign meant for South Africa's political trajectory. So I chose as the topic of my talk, consolidating an uncertain future. What do I mean by this? Well, we talk about the consolidation of democracy becoming the only game of town, and we think of it in terms of consolidating, making something more secure, more certain. I'm not sure that's what we've got. We may be consolidating democracy, but I'm not sure we're consolidating certainty. So I'm going to take you, there are four basic parts to my talk. The first is going back to some questions that I posed in our pre-election webinar around some of the paradigmatic issues of the election. Then I'm going to talk about electoral performance, the major parties, the minority parties, and then give you some sense of what I see as the key takeaways. Now, when I spoke a couple of months back, I said that there are two sort of overall paradigms that that political scientists have associated with South Africa. Admittedly, these have come in and out of favor, and there's considerable dispute about each. But I think that they remain useful. South Africa as a dominant party system, one in which we have formal procedural democracy, we have free and fair elections, but the same party is returned again and again. This is not a uniquely South African issue, nor one that's confined to the developing world. And what does it mean for South Africa as a divided society? This is a society in which political choices often follow a scriptive identities, where people vote their identities, where although you're free to make your offer, people will tend to vote as their parents did, or within their own sort of within their own sort of bubble, be that religion, be that ethnicity. Well, I think that what we've seen over the last couple of days has been is called for serious reconsideration. I think first of all, we have crossed a Rubicon. Now that's a phrase with certain implications for a South African. The dominant party paradigm, I think, is gone, because close to 2/3 of voters voted for parties other than the ANC. And I think this crosses a very important psychological line. The ANC is no longer the only game in town, whereas 24 years ago, it could refer to itself as the most important moral voice on any issue facing the country. Well, now it's not. Now it did not even secure a majority. Think about this tumble from 57% in the last election to around 40% now. Go back to 2004, the ANC got close to 70%. There, something is afoot, and the ANC's brand is no longer as it was. This is going to have knock-on effects, which I will get to when I look at the parties. But I would say it remains partly embedded in the divided society paradigm, because the ANC's decline has largely been a consequence of its internal breakaways and divides. Since 1994, there's been a cottage industry, I must confess to having indulged in this myself to some extent, of speaking about the split in the ANC. Now, we've seen splinters happening. There's the UDM, there was COPE, there's the EFF, now MK. I think that what we've seen here is it's reached a kind of critical mass. So the ANC is no longer dominant, but if we take the ANC and its offshoots, they sort of retain about 2/3 of the vote. In other words, that has remained actually remarkably stable. The MPC, the multi-party charter, which attempted to form a front to dislodge the ANC, it didn't reach 30%. I think what is interesting is that we have also seen the emergence of a party that campaigned on an unashamedly nativist and anti-constitutional platform. The EFF, I would say, has in the past shown a sort of ambivalence towards the constitutional order. MK's opening line is that it must be abolished. They are nativists. We need they're saying South Africa needs a system that is distinctly African and that turfs out all vestiges of colonialism, traditional leadership, all that sort of thing. This is not something that is that South Africa has had to contend with before. So I think what you've seen here is the splintering of the ANC family, if you like, the ANC tradition, but still what we have are very distinct polities. Talking about parties, right? Well, for obvious reasons, we have a picture of KwaZulu-Natal because that was where the game really went down. What does the election tell us? Well, the ANC remains a significant force, important constituencies, but I would say increasingly it is a party that represents rural African voters, and especially outside KwaZulu-Natal. Sorry, I seem to have made a few boo-boos there with capitalization. I think that this election has also shown some serious failures of political nous. Putting forward the idea of the NHI, more welfare spending. This, I think, blew up in its face. This has been explained in terms of the fact that private medical care is something that many South Africans, even those who can't always afford to access it, hold in high regard. And the basic narrative is that the state will take over is simply not a compelling one because the state has lost credibility. I think this also calls for a very significant worldview shift on the part of the ANC. As I said, the party that claimed to be the greatest moral voice in South Africa just isn't that any longer. They've woken up to a very, very different world. Now, there's a meme going around. The coldest place in South Africa is Luthuli House with minus 71. 71 people who are about to who are no longer going to be employed. People who know where certain bodies are buried. And think of this in terms of the knock-on effects, the ability to distribute patronage, jobs in the civil service, cadre deployment, etc., etc., etc. All of these certainties now start to look a lot less certain. And I think that this could well be a case of what happened to South Africa's previous dominant party, the National Party. When it was pushed out of its worldview, out of its comfort zone, it declined very rapidly. The National Party, new National Party, entered democracy with a respectable 20%, and a decade later was folding itself into its dread enemy, the ANC. Could something like this beckon for the ANC? I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility. I think actually this may be the tsunami. Remember, we used to hear that in 2009, but remember, a tsunami is something that carries all before. It's very destructive. And I think this could well be something the ANC has just faced. The Democratic Alliance, remains the dominant opposition party, but it regained some ground, but it didn't grow very much. I think it fended off a number of small party challenges, possible exception of the Patriotic Alliance. Represents a coalition of South Africa's minorities, and also I would say the established and emerging middle classes. If I may just get into the political science of this, I do think that a lot of the coverage of the DA has been very ill-informed. I for years have been hearing people, well, why can't the DA get the black vote? And I think that this mistakes the nature of the issue. First of all, I'm not sure there is such a thing as the black vote, but I think it's fundamentally almost a different polity, and this is where the divided society comes in. For a divided society, for a political party to actually have a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious constituency is quite an achievement, and the DA has done better than any other country or any other party in the country. But I do think the nature of its constituencies and the interests that it's putting forward do not translate very easily. And yeah, I think that this is now an issue that it is going to have to look at very hard. And perhaps maybe what the DA has now, that sort of 20% cut of the vote, may be as good as it gets, and not just for the DA, but perhaps for parties going forward in 2 or 3 election cycles. Perhaps this is it, 20%, 25% here and there. Mkhonto we Sizwe, South Africa's most successful post-1994 insurgency. It's in numerical terms, in impact, it smoked COPE, it smoked the EFF, put the UDM to shame. Now, we often hear the word populism. This is something else I do wish commentators would try and understand better. Populism is a distinct form of politics, a distinct kind of quasi-ideological offering. I believe that there's a strong case that the EFF is not in fact a populist party, but Mkhonto we Sizwe is, capitalizing on the simmering discontent, the idea that there is an us and them, ethno-nationalist mobilization that by definition excludes certain people, and the big man's personality, grievance, personality, frustration, and a clear Manichaean divide. This is a textbook case of populism. And I think this is something that the South African body politic will need to reckon with, because it is also promoting an explicitly anti-constitutional offering. Now, I don't believe that every person who voted for MK did so because they despise the Constitution, but certainly 14% of people going to Parliament do. Watch the space. The EFF, I think they actually emerge as something of a loser in this election, because small regression, not significant, but what this does is it dents the EFF's self-conception, the idea that it is the liberation movement successor to the liberation sellout by the ANC. A liberation movement, remember, must always be going forward. It must always be winning new victories. And I think it's been upstaged by MK, which I think is a more relatable offering. The bad boy behavior of the EFF, I don't think works particularly well for much of the country.
Sorry, Terence,
Jacob,
your slide is still on Democratic Alliance. I think it's not following your talk. Sorry.
Okay. Where is it now?
It's on the Democratic Alliance.
That's
number
weird.
7 of 13.
Okay.
So if you could just move your slides up.
Well, I'm trying. I've been moving them up, and is it not going? This is deeply odd. All right. Let me see. So still hasn't moved.
Okay, you are on the EFF now.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, so the EFF, I think that they have lost. That they face a situation where they claim to represent the kind of left alternative, if you like, the true revolution. I think that they are failing to find that. The bad boy politics that they represent, that they embodied in Parliament, I think sells very well. I think South Africa's electorate prefers the kind of more avuncular, grandfatherly, traditional, polite Jacob Zuma faction of things. So I think that's a big problem for them going forward. Okay, let me go on to the next slide. Are we still on the EFF?
Yes, we are.
How about now?
You're still on the EFF.
Now?
Still on it.
Okay, well, I'm moving it on my side.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Well, look. Then I suppose we've got to wait for technology to catch up with us. So speaking about the minority parties, the established parties, the IFP, the Freedom Front Plus, ACDP, Good, etc. I think they managed to hold their own, but not much besides. I think they are a reminder of the enduring importance of niche interests, identities, personalities, etc. And I do think, the the 1 or 2 seats here and there could put them in strong positions going forward as we enter the coalition era. But that also carries with it the danger of instability. I think the IFP's potential was badly whacked by MK, and I think that there's an interesting possible meeting of minds between the traditionalists in the IFP and the traditionalists in the MK about in KwaZulu-Natal. Watch the space. Then I don't imagine you can see it, but talking about the newly empowered minority parties. Yeah, we're talking the groups like the Patriotic Alliance, Action SA, Rise Mzansi, BOSA, etc. I think the Patriotic Alliance had a good election. It was well covered by the media. I think that another example of ethno-nationalism, grievance, and a charismatic personality. We'll see how that plays out. Action SA, I think, performed indifferently, below its potential. If I look at what polling says about the value orientations of South Africa's population, and I do think that for the most part, these parties demonstrate just how difficult it is to break into South Africa's party system. I'd like to make a quick comment about BOSA, Rise Mzansi, and the Independents. There was a great deal of certainly elite excitement about Rise Mzansi in particular. the sort of Social Democratic Party that the DA got into a lot of trouble because it dared to criticize them. What Tony Leon called the shiny new things. I think that this brand of politics just didn't get traction. Bosa tried, made an outright appeal to a personal campaign around Musi Maimane. I don't think that he actually had the gravitas that his followers may have assumed. The independents, I do think the deck was stacked against them, but also that went nowhere. So I think that we are stuck with the politics and the type of politics that we had in the past. So finally, what do we have? I do have a slide up here that says key observations, which I'm looking at, but I imagine you aren't. South Africa remains a divided society with two distinct political spheres, but it faces a much more fractious politics as a result of the decline of the ANC. And I think this is going to be an issue. How two forms of politics, one in the kind of middle class DA dominated space, the other in the ANC's former liberation movement space, how these things play out and how they find each other. The reformist options failed to gain momentum, but parties hostile to constitutionalism and non-racism have. This, I think, is going to drive a significant amount of polarization going forward. And I think what we have seen is a real populist challenge arising. And I don't mean populist in the sense of people saying nasty things. I mean real populism in terms of dividing society in different ways and trying to throw out the mediating institutions. And those third way options that got some people so excited are not emerging. I think we are stuck with the configuration we have. So with that, we face, as previous speakers have said, a very interesting and challenging 5 years ahead. I see that there's a news report that the ANC indicates it wants to commit to a government of national unity. I must say, I think that if they're going to try and bring in forces from across the spectrum, it's not workable. I think we are dealing with polar opposites and frankly, the ANC needs to choose. And with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Terence. Next up, we have Marius Ruert, who's the deputy editor of Daily Friend, and he's also a consultant on the Institute of Race Relations campaigns. Marius, the floor is yours for the next 15 minutes.
Thank you, Hussein. I'm trying to put my presentation up here.
Sure. Terence, can you take your presentation down, please?
I'm trying, but I see this seems to be stuck. Hold on.
Okay.
Okay. Is anyone mind showing?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
showing.
Okay. Cool. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Cool. Thank you. So I'm just going to talk a bit about the politics of fracture and what that could lead to. There's one of the things that I don't think we've spoken about yet, and that is voter turnout. And voter turnout has been terrible in South Africa over the last couple of years. So if you look in between 1999 and 2024, the number of eligible voters grew from about 24 million up to just under 40 million. The number of registered voters grew slightly as well. It went from about 18 million up to about 27 million. But the number of actual voters has stayed actually pretty flat at around 16, 17 million. And if you look at the proportion or the number of people who voted for the ANC, that has actually also declined quite precipitously now. So if you think about the proportion of people who are voting for the ANC, it's dropped significantly since 1994 and 1999 when the ANC was at its zenith. And I think this could also have some implications in the long term for South African politics. If more and more people leave the kind of check out of the democratic system and they don't see voting as really a way to as a legitimate way of political contestation, I think that could have some serious implications for South African democracy. So I think that's something definitely to keep an eye on. And I think we do need to get people more engaged in voting and so on. I think this is actually, in the long term, if we don't manage this, it could become a bit of a crisis of legitimacy for South African government. But our politics is fracturing to quite a significant degree. If we look at the number of parties that are represented in Parliament, in 1994, there were 7 parties represented in Parliament. In our new Parliament, we're going to have 18. So that's nearly a tripling. In 1994, there was only one party that had less than 1% of the vote in Parliament. That was the ACDP. Now we've got 10 parties that have less than 1% of the vote in the National Assembly. We have the same kind of phenomenon happening in our provincial legislatures. Strangely, the only province that's seen a reduction in the number of parties represented since in 1994 compared to 2024 is KZN, which in 1994 there were 7 parties represented. Now there's 6. But in other provinces, Gauteng especially, that's gone from 7 parties in 1994 to 11 now. So our politics is really starting to fracture, and that is going to make things difficult for governance, I think, especially now that the ANC has lost its majority. There's also been an urban shift, which is actually quite remarkable. If we look in 2014, the ANC won over 50% of the vote in the 8 metros. The DA had just over 30%, and the EFF was at about 7-8%. If we go to 2014, the ANC's overall vote share in the 8 metros fell just under 50%. The DA also fell slightly. Obviously, the 2019 was quite a bad election for the DA. It lost quite a lot of support to the Freedom Front Plus and so on. And the EFF grew slightly to just over 10%. And then if you look in 2024, it's absolutely, it's amazing. Any South African politics watcher will be quite astounded by this as well, I think. So the DA now received more votes in the 8 metros than the ANC did. And was a very close running thing between the two parties together. But I think it's 450,000 votes were cast for the two of them together. 4.5 million votes were cast for the two of them together in the various metros and so on, and they're only separated by 5,000 votes. So it's not as if the DA is completely dominating the metros, but I don't think anybody would have expected this a couple of years ago. And EFF has actually gone backwards compared to how it did in 2019, and that's obviously what we saw in the national picture as well. And that's obviously the Jacob Zuma and MK party effect. Especially, they got a real big boost from eThekwini, where they got 600,000 votes alone in that municipality. But they also outpolled the EFF in Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni. So that's also something to note. That's obviously, I think, because probably quite a few Zulu people live in those two municipalities. And as we've seen, the MK for now is still, I think, Zulu kind of ethno-nationalist party at the moment. We've all seen how poorly it did outside KwaZulu-Natal, with the exceptions of Mpumalanga and Gauteng. So yeah, we'll have to keep an eye on that and see what happens. So, but what does this all mean? So now that we've got this politics of fracture, there's no one single party that's dominating South African politics. So we're either going to get minority governments, we're going to get, and if we go for coalitions, they're going to be unwieldy. As it stands, the ANC, if it wants to govern with only one other party nationally, that would be the MK party. And we know what the issues around that would be. They'd probably insist on getting rid of President Ramaphosa, which I don't think the ANC would want to do. That would also obviously be very bad for markets and so on. So, and what could that lead to? Professor Burger alluded to this. Could this lead to gridlock? Now, what does gridlock mean? Gridlock means that legislation can't be passed. It means that the legislature is kind of stuck, and it's things just don't get done. Some people will tell you that that's maybe a good thing. In Belgium, they had an election where it took 500 days for a government to be formed, and Belgians say that that was one of the golden ages for the Belgian people. Obviously, I'm being a bit facetious here, but I don't think South Africa has the kind of institutions that Belgium has. But that's something to think about. So, what could lead to gridlock? Obviously, there's no majority to pass legislation. That's something I think that's could be obviously a possibility if no coalition is formed. Another way is if parties decide to boycott legislative sittings and no quorums can be formed either, even say from your coalition partners, and they just decide not to attend parliamentary sittings and a quorum can't be formed and we don't see any legislation being passed. There could also even be gridlock through physical disruptions. We've already seen in South Africa that this has happened, especially with the EFF and to a lesser degree the ANC in places where it's been in opposition in various metros and so on. It's also happened in countries abroad. In India is an example of that. The BJP, which is now the governing party, would often actually get involved in physically disrupting legislative sittings if it didn't like what was possibly going to happen with the legislation that was going to be passed. And there could also be infighting in the governing party, which sees discipline being lacking in the party, and that's also leading to gridlock. We saw that happen in the UK in the Tory party and the Conservatives when they're fighting over trying to pass the various Brexit deals. Obviously, the UK system is a little bit different from ours, but I think that's something that can't be discounted, especially if we see factional fighting within the ANC, especially over perhaps deciding who to support bringing in the MK party or the DA, whatever the case is. I think we're already seeing these kind of factional battles happening in the ANC. But minority governments are also quite common abroad, especially in places with proportional representation. They've been in places like Scotland and New Zealand and so on. They get minority governments have been in the past. There's also been in Canada, which is a first past the post system rather than proportional representation. Minority governments can work. The record on them is a bit mixed. In New Zealand and Scotland, where there have been minority governments, they've passed less legislation than when there have been majority governments, because there has to be consensus seeking and it takes longer to pass legislation and all that kind of thing. And another, what we could also have in South Africa that probably won't happen in necessarily in this Parliament, but is an adversarial National Council of Provinces versus the National Assembly. That would be if a certain coalition comes to power in the National Assembly and the various provinces are controlled by different parties. We could see that the NCOP manages to block certain legislation coming from the National Assembly. Obviously, the NCOP only has control or can only block certain legislation. I think it's the Section 76 legislation, which affects provinces. But this is something that could happen in the future, and it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And so what are some solutions? I think possibly we need to look at something like electoral thresholds. I know it's not all that popular in South Africa, but I do think there's an argument to be made that you only get a seat in, get represented in various legislatures if you can demonstrate a minimum level of support. It's common in other parts around the world which use proportional representation systems like South Africa, that a party must get a certain level. It varies around the world. It's 5% in New Zealand and Germany. It's 3.25% in Israel, I think. So that's something we can definitely think about. I think it's some thought needs to be given to it. I know there has already been some thought given to it, coming from the government and various parties. But this is something that I think it is important to, I think people who are interested in this definitely need to start thinking about whether this is the way that South Africa needs to go. We also perhaps need a longer period after elections to form governments. As we all know, the new government has to be formed within 14 days. And in most other proportional representation systems, they have much longer periods to form governments. As I mentioned earlier, Belgium sat without a government for nearly 500 days. Obviously, I don't think that's ideal, but I think we need a longer period than the 14 days. And you see this kind of panicked negotiation between our various political parties. Maybe a good compromise would be something like a 30-day period or a month, or maybe a little bit longer than that. But that's definitely something we need to look at. In the longer term, we need to perhaps look at things like legally binding coalition agreements. Maybe something like a coalition ombudsman who could be appointed to look at when we have disagreements between coalition partners. And maybe there could also be a limit on things such as motions of no confidence Ekurhuleni has a limit on how many motions of no confidence you can have. I think you can't have one. You can only have one every 6 months, and I don't know if that's really helpful that much because Ekurhuleni has also been quite unstable. But that's something to look at. And then just finally, some people will say that gridlock might actually be a good thing for South Africa. I'm only being semi-facetious, but the thing is, if legislation doesn't get passed, that can have problems for the country. There's been 2 examples recently where South Africa had to pass legislation pretty quickly to meet international agreements. One was the one on being removed from being grey listed. We had to meet certain requirements from the FATF, and legislation's been done quite quickly around that. There was another one where South Africa had to meet certain requirements from the World Anti-Doping Agency to be able to take part in various for South African teams and South African sportsmen to take part in international tournaments and so on. And there was actually a slight risk that the Springboks at the end of last year would not have been able to play under the Springbok colours or under the national flag because of they wouldn't if we hadn't managed to pass that legislation. But I think from when the legislation had to be passed to from when the legislation started being drawn up to when it was passed, and this included the public process of consulting with the public and so on. It took only about 3 months. So legislation can be passed quickly, but if we have a issue of gridlock, then we could have problems. Obviously, the Springboks not being able to play under national colours isn't something that's, I mean, I don't think anybody else would like to see that, but it's obviously not going to really affect the country that significantly. But if we can't pass legislation to meet certain requirements to get us off the grey list and so on, that can have quite serious effects on things such as investment and so on. So overall, I think, as all the speakers have said, we're going into quite an uncertain time now. And I think the issue of gridlock is one that people haven't really thought about too much, but I think it's one that we are going to be facing. And I think South Africans need to get ready for it. And also another thing, I think our political parties just need to start getting a bit more mature and realize that they're running a country for everybody who lives here, and not just for themselves or certain vested interests. But yeah, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Marius, for an informative presentation. Professor Philippe Burger just shared his presentation, which was published in The Conversation. So you will see it in the chat function here. And our final speaker is Sinette Solomon. She's a political analyst and she's a lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at UNISA, the University of South Africa. So, Sinette, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for having me. For marketing purposes, I'm going to use this very cool banner from the University of South Africa. Yes, yes. Mine is the concluding presentation. So I will just be summing up a lot of what the other colleagues have already covered. So as you all know, we are obviously having a discussion about life post the 29th of May, which is obviously an exciting time. But just a bit of context in terms of those who happen to just join us a bit later. One of the exciting things about this elections is that it was obviously our 7th democratic elections as a country, and it also is the year in which we celebrated 3 decades of democracy. And as we all know, democracies go through ebbs and flows, and we also have a lot of opportunities and also challenges as we navigate this particular space. So I'll start with my presentation with a little bit of context in terms of how our numbers are looking. So, and this obviously feeds into the entire discussion that we've been having this morning. So as you all are aware, for a bit of context, the ANC ended off on just over 40%, the DA on 21%, MK on 14.5%, and then the EFF on 9.5%. And that's very important as we go into this discussion on what possible coalitions could look like and how they would implement or influence our country. And then just a breakdown in terms of how it looks per province. This also helps in terms of just forming a bit of background in your mind as we have this discussion further. As you are all aware already, the Western Cape, which is quite a big metro, is under DA, would be under DA governance. KwaZulu-Natal would be like possibly under MK governance, and then we have Gauteng, which would also have a slightly different configuration as we have had in the past. So one of the exciting things about democracies, as I mentioned, is that we go through ebbs and flows, and there's a lot of opportunities for growth and development. So as we are all aware, for the past 30 years, we have been under ANC governance, and that has obviously had its own implications in terms of how we receive our democracy, or how we accept our democracy, rather. Over the past 30 years, there have been a number of challenges, but also a number of opportunities. I mean, South Africa enjoys a great constitution, which is celebrated across the world. We have access to free basic education, healthcare, the signing on of the new national health insurance, access to social services, and so on. But likewise, there have also been a number of challenges in terms of governance. We've seen a lot of service delivery protests. We've seen a lot of governance challenges, such as like municipalities being poorly governed and then possibly being under administration. And this also impacted largely in terms of the number of people registering. But unlike some of our previous elections, we have noted that this election had quite a number of challenges. And this obviously also played a role in terms of our voter turnout, which is much lower than it has been in the past. So post the election, one of the key things that came from it was obviously a number of institutions declaring our elections as free and fair. And I think that is quite a remarkable feat given our history as a country. But I also think one of the plus points was that the ruling ANC, contrary to a lot of people's thoughts and obviously their ideas prior to the election, actually accepted the results in terms of what the outcome of this election is. And I know that one of the key things currently dominating not only this discussion, but a lot of media coverage is possible coalitions in terms of the South African context. And I think one of the most important things in terms of going into a coalition is obviously policy alignment between the different political parties. Because this would obviously have a huge impact in terms of the various implications for policy documents which will have, as well as our country's credit profile, as that also impacts our ability to govern our country. So one of the key, and I would say one of the more popular coalitions that people, and obviously the financial sector, would push for is a possible DA-ANC coalition. But one of the key things that is that the DA is actually opposed to the introduction of the national health insurance, not the document in its entirety, but the idea that there are possibilities within the document that are less feasible than others. And I think one of the second largest ones is obviously the ANC's Black economic empowerment policies, which is something that they would also not waver on. One of the key things that has been stressed in terms of the discussions on possible coalitions is obviously the importance of the rule of law, the importance of the constitution. And one of the things that the DA pushes quite hard for is a social market economy that obviously treats both the private sectors as well as like the state as equal partners in terms of this growth agenda, which is also something that aligns with what the ANC is like rooting for. There's obviously a push in terms of a zero tolerance for corruption and cadre deployment, and this might be slightly a bit of a challenge given the ANC's own policies in terms of cadre deployment. But additionally, it should also be mentioned that while the DA doesn't have a formal cadre deployment policy, they also have a way of deploying the political office bearers to different offices. So it'd be interesting to see how they would be able to navigate a relationship between their different policies with regards to that. But another possibility, and obviously this is great in terms of Cyril's renewal agenda, is that zero tolerance in terms of corruption and how you would go about actually implementing there. If there was to be a coalition between the ANC and the DA, given the numerous different stances on a number of issues, it is more likely to take on a formal coalition and or agreement between these two parties. But it would also allow Cyril Ramaphosa to continue his priorities in terms of tackling infrastructure issues and so on, which is also something that Professor Berger mentions in his article, which he shared in the chat, which I think is something that's quite exciting. But I think for DA supporters, what they would then advocate for is, for the very first time, they would be able to have access to government, they'd have a say in terms of our legislative agenda, and then obviously that would enable them to also crack down in terms of corruption. But again, this might be an opportunity for the possible renewal of the ANC, but it also might be a challenge for people who've been implicated in terms of issues such as state capture and other like forms of irregularities. Again, there's obviously a huge risk in terms of, for both of these political parties. One would be that the DA supporters may not be quite in favor of wanting to be in a coalition with the ANC, as they may believe that it doesn't align with their values and so on. And this may possibly result in them joining another political party, like, for example, your Vryheidsfront, or a more metro party, which would be an option like an Action SA or a possible Rise Mzansi. For the ANC, there would be another challenge in terms of its own voter base, where people would obviously not be in favor of a former liberation movement entering to a party that also has or that has perceived links to the apartheid struggle, etc. And so that could obviously cause a lot of turbulence in terms of these different support bases. And then if you had to look at what Steenhuisen would call the doomsday coalition, would obviously be an ANC-EFF coalition or an ANC-MK coalition, which a lot of people would also be in favor of, but not necessarily the markets. So many believe that if you look at the policies in terms of the MK, the EFF, and the ANC, there is a lot of overlaps in terms of these policies, obviously resulting in policy alignment. And because of this policy alignment, it may also result in the production of similar policies. And obviously, some people may think that this may result in slow economic growth, the continuation of what we're seeing in the country, whereas other people believe that it would be easier to govern given the similarities between these different political parties. One of the key things that came out of obviously this past week is that the ratings agency Fitch has warned that if the ANC were to obviously get into a coalition with either the MK or the EFF, that could have major macroeconomic or could have major implications for our macroeconomic stability, because it may result in our debt trajectory not looking so good, but also it may also result in the country adopting short-term policies in order to ensure that they are able to govern together, but this may have long-term implications in terms of that. And I think this also links back to the fact that the economic freedom fighters would want to have obviously the position of finance, and they also want the position of the Speaker of National Assembly. And all of these positions are quite key, because one of the things that happens is, say your president is, for example, unable to continue, then you have your deputy president continuing, and if the deputy president can't, then the Speaker of the National Assembly then takes over. So there's a lot of implications in terms of this, and this obviously bears in mind how your business and how the international community impacts or responds to some of these challenges. So there are obviously a number of concerns that have aligned, as I mentioned earlier on. A possible coalition between the MK and the ANC may obviously result in political stability in terms of the country, but it may also translate into low economic growth due to the similarities in terms of the economic policies. A lot of people are also concerned about the implications for legal impunity, where you have people who were previously implicated in state capture and other forms of corruptions and financial irregularities also moving on without them being obviously prosecuted. And they also believe that this could also result in constraints in terms of funding, because you then don't want to capacitate those agencies that are supposed to proceed with these corruption allegations. And I think that's for the people who have a stronger focus in terms of our domestic security and possible renewal for the state. Secondly, there is a lot of concerns that this possible coalition between an MK and an ANC may also have an impact, or an MK and a EFF may also have an impact in terms of our country's economy and the foreign direct investment that we would have. They believe that it might signal to the global community that very little change has taken place, and that there could be future like financial irregularities, and or that they wouldn't be able to govern the state as well as a possible ANC-DA coalition. And then obviously, again, the rule of law comes in here, where there is a lot of concerns in terms of legal impunity, in terms of what certain people have been accused of. There's also obviously possibilities that things could go right. A lot of analysts also believe that a possible DA-ANC coalition could result in Gauteng being in a better or better governed as it has been over the past few years. They believe that it could provide investor confidence, that it could result in robust economic growth, as these two parties would seek to hold each other more accountable. But also it carries then threats for instability, particularly in KZN, given how different KZN would be governed in with respect to this. And so one of the key things that we haven't touched on as much as when we're just looking at these formulations is that some of the smaller parties have a bigger focus in terms of which offices they'd like to occupy and what positions they'd like to occupy, not necessarily the alignment in terms of policies. And this could obviously have a ripple effect in terms of how sustainable this is for a country, because when people vote for you, they don't necessarily vote for you to occupy safe position, but also for you to implement that which you have promised to your constituency. So it's a matter of finding a balance between those two. So one of the most likely outcomes in terms of the formulation of these coalitions would be obviously a DA-ANC coalition, where they would together have 57.5% of it, or sorry, they would have slightly more than that. And then the DA would also, or DA-ANC coalition would also result in obviously more stability for the rand, and it is estimated that this would increase by 2.5%, which is obviously great. One of the things that would be good for the country but not necessarily good for the current ruling party is obviously some financial physical tightening, which would mean that we would obviously have changes in terms of how our budget is spent. It would also mean that we'd be streamlining some of our spending, and this might also impact in terms of our wages and grants that are currently quite inflated. As you all know, quite a substantive number of South Africans are dependent on social grants, but beyond the social grants, for example, like your old age grants or your foster grants and so on, there are additional grants like that the ANC has recently implemented, like your unemployment grant, the 350 rands, which some believe is financially sustainable, whereas others believe is less financially sustainable given the number of people that are actually paying taxes in terms of the country. So that might cause a possible turbulence and obviously also a deadlock in between the DA and the ANC in terms of discussions on how they would be dealing with this. With the issue of wages, it also means that there would possibly be a freezing of appointments in government positions, but also I think that that might mean restructuring certain government departments, which may translate in like possible unemployment increases, etc. Then obviously a DA-ANC coalition may also mean that there's more certainty in terms of improved business environment and also pro-growth strategies, and I think that would be in alignment with what Ramaphosa was trying to achieve during his administration with just the ANC in office versus what the DA has also been pushing for. So that would allow for a continuation and a possible implementation of some of those strategies. And I think obviously you'd still have the continuation of your disability and social relief grants, because a lot of South Africans are dependent on that, and it's also a great way in terms of the state for taking care of its people. But also with increased economic growth, you would have not job creation opportunities, but you'd actually have actual job creation, where a lot of people would then move away from this codependency in terms of a 350 to possible dignified employment that would be more long term, and that's obviously something that would be great. This possible coalition would also have an impact in terms of Eskom's energy generation and how it is obviously managed. It would also impact on business regulations. It would also have a big push in terms of your triple BEE, which is also often cited as one of the reasons why there's such low investments in terms of the country. So it is a great balance, or trying to strike a balance between two different very huge political parties and trying to see what it could mean for the country. But it is also an opportunity to repair a lot of what is currently broken and what is currently being hampered in terms of this. So I think something that we haven't quite discussed is that our constitution indicates that we have to have, like, obviously a government sitting in parliament 90 days after the elections, and the question then becomes, what happens if we don't have such a thing forming? It simply means that there might have to be free elections, which is something which would have a ripple effect in terms of it, whether the IEC would have the necessary resources given their cut budget, whether or not South Africans would be willing to return to the polling stations for the second time, whether or not this would have implications in terms of our voter turnout. Will more people be showing up? Will we be seeing different changes? And what would this mean for us as a country, given that we have never had that happen within our democracy? And I think that all of this points towards further discussions beyond just what possible coalitions could be, but what happens if towards that 2-week mark we still haven't found possible solutions, and how do we as a country navigate it? Are we ready for such a possibility, or are we going to try to find alternative means to actually try to formulate a coalition? And I think that's where the previous presentation comes into effect. Why not extend the period for possible negotiations for the formulation of a coalition, as that might be an easier and a more affordable alternative, as opposed to having new and fresh elections? So I'll just stop there. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Thank you so much, Sanette. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is open for questions, but may I ask, given the fact that Professor Burger will have to leave this meeting in the next few minutes, that you pose any questions to him first before engaging with the other speakers. Okay, there's a hand up here. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Ishmael. Call me Ish. Professor Burger, you talked at length about, actually all of you, it's not only you. I don't get a sense that we have emphasized enough the quality of leaders, because 1994 were much more polarized. It needed a particular type of context, particular type of leader. Your comments before you leave?
Thank you, Ish. Well, I think the next couple of weeks, 2 weeks, will show us what sort of leadership we have, and whether we have leadership that can put the country first and really pull us through into a coalition that can work. But it will be more than that. You know, forming a coalition is one thing. Maintaining that coalition over an extended period of time is also quite difficult. And even there, we are not, we don't have that much of that much experience. We will remember that even in '94, the government of national unity that was formed only lasted 2 years, when the then National Party decided to abandon that and leave that that sort of coalition. So we will have to see what happens this time around. Thank you.
Colleagues, is there any other questions for Professor Burger? Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Burger, and thank you also for putting your article in the conversation of the conversation in the chat function. Thank you very much, colleagues. So the floor is once more open for questions to all speakers. Marius, I was wondering while we're waiting for other people to engage, when you did that graph pertaining to the declining support of the ANC in the urban areas, that struck me incredibly. Could you maybe explain a bit more about this, because it kind of reminds me in terms of where ZANU-PF right now is in terms of it being largely a rural-based party.
Yeah, I think it's just it's inevitable. In many ways, the ANC is sort of a conservative party, as in it supports the broad status quo, and in general, cities don't generally support your conservative parties or parties been in power for a long time. I mean, the UK is a good example. I think, the biggest cities support Labour versus the Tories or more the countryside. The US is the same. The big cities support the Democrats in general, and smaller places support the Republicans. So I think that's just maybe kind of the ANC also being supported by people who are older and that kind of thing. And we know, I mean, I don't know what the exact figures are, but I would be very surprised if our cities don't skew younger than the rural areas. But I think it's all just also part of just South Africa's kind of democratic maturing. But that all said, if you add the ANC proportion to what MK got, it still comes to about 45% in just the cities. So that's obviously assuming that all MK voters would have been former ANC voters, which obviously I don't think is true. I think they took quite a lot from the EFF and perhaps from the IFP, even though the IFP went up in these elections. So I think it's just what happens across the world, I think, where younger people, people more socially mobile maybe look for parties which are trying to shake things up perhaps, and we can argue about whether how MK would want to shake things up and if that's what would be desirable for South Africa. But I think it is, but that's something a lot of people have spoken about though as well. The ANC is kind of doing the following ZANU-PF in some ways. It's where it's becoming more party of the rural areas. One thing that I'd have to say is I'm very glad that the ANC hasn't followed ZANU-PF in the way it reacts to losing support in elections. And I think that's maybe something, I think a lot of people have spoken about it, but I think it's also worth just saying that I think the way the ANC did react to this has been very mature, and I think it does bode well for the sustainability of our democracy.
Thank you, Marius. I have to concur there. I actually thought that President Ramaphosa's speech was really good at the IEC. General Barlow, can I ask you a question? In the run-up to the elections, several people raised questions about the possibility of violence, but the violence did not materialize. Do you have any particular reasons why it did not materialize?
Prof, not really, no. I think in the run-up to the election, there was a lot of scaremongering going around, and one might even consider it to almost be sort of a psychological intimidation of people. But I think people have also realized that this violence prior to and during election actually counts to their disadvantage and doesn't really help them at all. And in fact, I think the good thing about the peaceful way that this went ahead, it did a lot to restore our, for want of a better word, our tattered image abroad as well, because there were a lot of media reports abroad, that were expecting a lot of violence here. So that's the best way I can answer that. But I think really people have also just realized that violence is going nowhere in an election.
Thank you, General. Terence and Sanette, I do have a question for you. And Terence, I see your hand is up. And my question is this. So right now you have the different political parties engaging with each other in terms of coalition talks and horse trading and so on. And of course, there's principles and so on. But how much of leeway do they have in terms of their respective constituencies to maybe sell a deal which may not be popular? Terence, you and then Sanette.
Okay, I think that you would have to define constituencies. I think that polling shows that the sort of ANC DA hookup is actually a fairly popular option amongst ordinary South Africans. I think where it becomes controversial, and I think this is where where it will be feasible or not, is amongst your sort of organized constituencies. Now, for the DA, I think that there are people that some of their business backers would be very much in favor. I think many of the DA's ordinary supporters would be quite appalled, because it would mean going with the ANC and the governance pathologies which have come to be associated with it. For the ANC, you've seen, for instance, Cosatu saying that they should rather go with the EFF, which I found quite. I found that intriguing, because what they seem to be saying is the kind of that they would rather go with racial nationalist quasi-fascism than with the party of the bosses, which says I think that there's an interesting message there about the state of the South African left. So yeah, and then within the ANC, certainly, there's these provincial fiefdoms that have been created. There are, the whole patronage network that's created through the civil service. All of those stand to lose if anything is done differently. The problem is we can't sustainably carry on doing what we're doing now. So you choose: do we have another sort of 5 years of dysfunction and then face the music, or do you actually start taking the damage now? And I think this is also where this a phrase that drives me out of my mind is, we must do what is in the best interest of the country. Well, everyone says that, but exactly what that is depends on the perspective of the person speaking. Former President Zuma would say that turning over governance to traditional authorities is in the best interest of the country. Blaine Zamandi would probably say putting the business community up against the wall and shooting them is the best interest of the country. I would say that accepting the limitations of a very compromised state and adjusting accordingly would be the best interest of the country. So verbiage like that doesn't really take us forward.
Okay, Sanette.
I think that this outcome of this election signals what the South African population wants. I think there was a reason why we didn't have an outright winner. And I think that it possibly could be because South Africa would like political parties to actually find a way to co-govern the country. And I think it could be that you have a little bit of trust in this one governing, but you have someone else who would possibly have your best interests at heart. And I think that's where the co-governance comes in. And I think that's where trying to find solutions come in. And I think that Terence is right in that political parties tend to have their own interest at heart when they say that they're actually here to serve the nation and or they're doing something in the best interest of the country. And I think that these discussions between the political parties would actually force them to actually try and find a midway, halfway in terms of actual tangible solutions that would actually benefit the country. And as I mentioned in my presentation, I think that their focus should be on the policies as opposed to the personalities. I think that if you are able to meet another party halfway in terms of finding policies that would work best for the country, you could do that. But I do think that this fixation on just different positions actually points towards self-interest. And I think that once the discussions have been concluded, we'll get a more accurate reflection of who actually was willing to put their needs aside in order to find a solution that would best benefit the country, and who was able to just share what they wanted despite what it might mean for the country.
Okay, thank you. There are two final questions. I got one from Ish and one from Melindy. So we'll take those and then we will get a final round of responses. Ish, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm curious to know whether the folks here understand what is the power balance within existing factions within the ANC or various, alliance partners, because I wonder, will Ramaphosa listen to COSATU, Communist Party, SANCO? Those are some of their of their factions.
Okay, thank you. Melindy, can you go ahead with your question?
Thanks and good afternoon to everyone in the platform. I've got two questions, one to Eben and the other one to Marius. Starting with Marius, can I pick your brain? About a week ago, shortly after elections, Dr. Frans Cronje was in a BizNews podcast. He reckons that President Ramaphosa's signing of the NHI bill was catastrophic for their elections, because that saw the black middle class and aspiring black middle class moving away from the ANC and probably towards other parties like the DA, Rise Mzansi, Action SA, and BOSA. I would really want to check his take on it. And secondly, I hear the panel kind of suggest that there hasn't been violence in these elections. Fine, it could have been at a smaller proportion, but the fact remains there was violence. In the Eastern Cape, for instance, and this goes to Eben, in the Eastern Cape, for instance, on the Monday of special votes, the first day of the special vote, that Monday, taxi bosses blockaded all entrances and exits coming from Tata. Myself, I was supposed to be campaigning in the area. We were told in no uncertain terms that you can't campaign, and there was looting, and thank goodness 2 people have been arrested. It went to a point of some taxi bosses wanted to hijack the airport in Mthatha, and police acted very swiftly. So really, Eben, my question to you: do you think our law enforcement agencies are well prepared and proactive in trying to prevent these kind of actions? I'm saying this because the 2 days preceding the Monday of the Mthatha violence, there have been voice notes and video clips doing rounds on social media, taxi bosses warning us not to get closer to Mthatha, and yet the police or our security cluster just couldn't plan well ahead to prevent that kind of violence. Thank you.
Okay, thank you both for your questions. Colleagues, as this is the final thing, I'm going to do it in the order of the presentation. So I'm going to ask General Barlow to respond, followed by Terence Corrigan, Marius Ruert, and Sinette Solomon. And any of your final thoughts, please. So, General Barlow.
Lindy, thanks. A very good point you raise, and all of this, as far as I'm concerned, boils down to not only a failure in intelligence, but a failure to be proactive. Before the elections, and you're right, yes, there was violence, but not at the level we experienced previously. Prior to the elections, especially social media was weaponized and leveraged to tell people what to do, where not to go, how to act, etc. The fact that law enforcement finally reacted is a very good thing, but I do believe they could have been a lot more proactive, because by being reactive as they were, I think there were a lot of people who were also denied the possibility not only to campaign, but also to go and vote. So are we up to the task? I doubt it. And I think that's one of the things that the national security strategy ought to point out, and that is, what should our intelligence services look like? How should they be structured, and what are their mandates? And they must stick with their mandates and not become services that are used in order to afford protection to certain people only. They're there to protect the nation and the state, and therefore all intelligence should be assessed in other words, to see what is the veracity of it, how correct is it, and then we should act. And I don't think that's what we follow.
Thank you. Terence?
Look, I think that in some, we had a successful election. Whether we can pass it into a successful 5 years is an open question. On the issue of violence, I think there's an important distinction that one needs to make. First of all, South Africa is not uniform. The political cultures in different areas are different. Now, KwaZulu-Natal has a fairly violent political culture, and that's as a general rule. The Western Cape, despite having a great deal of violent crime, does not have a violent political culture. And I think that the differences between let's say straight pure politics and various interest groups that might seek to influence the political debate, like your taxi owners, like your construction mafia, those are often very permeable. South Africa, still I think has a going concern as a democracy, but it is not an issue. But it is not something that should be taken for granted.
Thank you. Marius?
On that question of NHR, it's obviously hard to answer with any certainty unless you could ask, do some kind of survey. But there was definitely a correlation between, if you saw the polling after the NHR being signed, and a decline in ANC support. And there seems to be quite a lot of support for private healthcare. The last stat I saw, it's a couple of years old now, but even though only 16% of people are on medical aid, up to 40% of South Africans use the private healthcare system in some way. They might just pay out of pocket to go see a GP, or whatever the case is. And if you look at surveys where they've spoken to people about vouchers for healthcare systems, for private healthcare, there seems to be a lot of support for it. So obviously, I don't think you can say with any certainty that is that did harm the ANC, but I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility. And also, to be very unscientific, just looking on social media on Twitter, and it seemed a lot of people who I assume were black just from their names on Twitter or whatever the case is, seemed they didn't really seem in support of NHR and quite upset about the threat of people's healthcare being taken away. So yeah, just to summarize, I don't think you can say with certainty it was, but I also don't think you can just dismiss France's assumption out of hand.
Marius, sorry, there was a question posed to you pertaining to the balance of forces within the ANC alliance, your COSATU and all the other formations.
Yeah, I think it's very Byzantine, the whole ANC and the NEC. But I think since Jacob Zuma did lose in 2017, Cyril Ramaphosa has seemed to have quite a lot of support within the NEC. Obviously, such a big, broad tent organization such as the governing party, there's going to be a lot of different kinds of elements and different forces and so on. But does seem, even looking at the loss of support that Ramaphosa has or the ANC received, there does seem to be a lot of support for the president still within the ANC. And I mean, there've been news reports saying that senior people want him to resign, but all the public and media releases and things that people like Fikile and Balula have come out and said seems to be quite a lot of backing for Ramaphosa. So at the moment, it seems he is not on the back foot as he could have been. But yeah, it remains to be seen what happens. But I do think he's probably, over the last couple of years, he does seem to be have decent control over the ANC. But yeah, we'll have to see what happens. And I mean, from what I've seen in the last week or so, it does seem that he is getting backing in general from the ANC and its senior leaders.
Thank you. Sinet, any last thoughts from your side? Sinet, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry, I was talking to myself. I'll answer the same question as Marius. With regards to balancing the interests, I think that it has always been quite difficult for the ANC to make a decision based on its own, obviously, because it has all of these other partners in terms of the tripartite alliance. And I think that obviously their interests and desires would have to be taken into account as well when making the decision in terms of who you will be going into a coalition with. So it's not as straightforward. While the markets may want an ANC-DA coalition, I think that there might be a push for the ANC to go with other smaller parties, for example, an ANC, IFP, and possibly another smaller party would make more sense, because then the ANC will still remain the dominant figure in terms of the relationship with the coalition partners. It would still be able to continue with its policies and its direction while it tries to regain its support base and so on. I think that if the ANC were to go with one of the bigger other parties, for example, the DA-ANC alliance as it is proposed, I think that might mean losing too much control for the ANC. For example, they would then have to give up the position of deputy president to the DA, and that obviously means that the natural succession would be, should Ramaphosa have to leave for some or other reason, that the DA person or the DA candidate then becomes president. And the question is whether South Africa would be ready to have John Steenhuisen as a possible alternative leader. And I don't think that that's necessarily what South Africans may want. And I think, therefore, I think possibly working with the MK or possibly working with the EFF, it might not be what they want. They might not want to give, especially finance, over to the EFF or Speaker of Parliament, because Speaker of Parliament is quite a key position, but they might be willing to negotiate in terms of other positions that they might be willing to give up. But I don't think that we should forego the possibility of them going with smaller parties. I think it might make more sense for them to go with smaller parties and give them that 1 or 2 seats or 1 or 2 departments. But I do think that they would lose complete control if they were to go with those larger parties, particularly the EFF and particularly the DA. And I think that those the members of the tripartite alliance would keep that in mind when making a decision in terms of what their stance would be. And I think that the ANC will definitely take those points into consideration, because at the end of the day, you need those unions and you need your other support base in order for you to regrow yourself and possibly regain yourself in preparation for the local government elections.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen and lady, thank you all for your input. I'm going to hand the floor over to my partner in this endeavor, Terence Corrigan, to say the closing remarks. Terence, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Hussein. And we, from the point of view of the Institute of Race Relations, I think it's been another successful collaboration between ourselves and the Center for Gender and Africa Studies. We value this partnership as a contributor both to our own work, and we hope to yours, and also to the national conversation on these very, very weighty issues. South Africa, it's a country with brimming with so much potential, but so tortured by its past and by the missteps and insecurities of the present. And we do hope that that for those of you who've graciously given your time to be here, you will be able to take something something from this into the societal conversation. Thank you to everybody, and have a wonderful day further.
Bye, Sabre.